The night air hung heavy in the streets of Atlanta, cold and biting. It was late February, 1970, and the city's hustle had faded into quiet, save for the low hum of distant traffic and the faint sound of a street lamp flickering to life. The city was trying to rest, but not everyone could sleep. Tiffany Carter, 16, stood at the entrance of the Atlanta Public Library, her bicycle resting beside her on the icy sidewalk. She had stayed a little longer than usual, poring over pages of her history textbook. The school project was important, but the snowstorm that had been creeping in throughout the evening had forced her to hurry. She could feel the weight of it in the air, the chill growing sharper with each passing minute. She was alone. Her parents were expecting her home by 9 p.m. Her mother, Clara, had set the table for dinner at 8:30, waiting with the kind of patience only a mother could muster. Her father, Charles, had already been back from the hardware store for an hour, his work boots resting near the door. The soft ping of her bike's tires against the sidewalk was the last thing she heard as she pedaled down West End Avenue, her pink wool coat cutting through the foggy twilight. Her long brown hair blew slightly behind her as she turned left at the corner, headed toward the river. The streets were empty now, the snow turning to slush beneath her tires as she moved toward the library's back alley. At the edge of town, near Dent Bridge, there was a small corner store, a gas station that sat like an old, weathered sentinel. Earl Dawson, the attendant, recalled seeing Tiffany that night. She had come in earlier to grab a bottle of soda, smiled, and paid in loose change before she left. He said she seemed in a hurry but didn't look afraid. She was always polite, that one, Earl would later say, shaking his head at the thought. A smile on her face, like the rest of the world, didn't matter. That night, Earl would be the last person to see her alive. As Tiffany pedaled along the riverside road, the snowflakes started to fall, thick and fast. They glistened against the yellow streetlights, quickly turning the night into an unrelenting blanket of white. The wind had picked up, sharp now against her cheeks. She passed the bridge, the dark water below reflecting the dim glow from the streetlights, before she stopped, just a few meters from the bridge's edge. The path ahead was slick, the snow crunching under her tires as she dismounted to adjust the laces of her boots. Her fingers fumbled a little in the cold. Her last moments before vanishing were as mundane as that. No signs of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. A truck driver later would recall seeing a girl in a pink coat standing by her bike, her back to the world as she bent over to fix something. That was the last known sighting of Tiffany Carter. When Clara Carter set the dinner plates on the table that night, she set 3, one for herself, one for Charles, and one for Tiffany. Her daughter was late, but not unusually so. Clara wasn't worried at first. It wasn't until the clock struck 9:30 and then 9:45 that the nagging sense of unease began to twist in her stomach. Charles, leaning against the kitchen counter, had looked at her. "She's probably just caught in the snow. You know how it gets out there," he'd said, trying to comfort her, but the uncertainty in his voice hadn't escaped Clara. It was too quiet outside, too still. Charles pulled on his coat and left the house, calling Tiffany's name into the wind, his breath cutting through the night. He drove around the neighborhood, past the empty streets of West End, through the drizzle that had turned to freezing rain. By the time he reached the gas station, the snow had already started to blanket the streets in a thick, unbroken layer. "Seen her?" he asked Earl Dawson, who was inside the station, wiping the counter. Earl paused, furrowing his brow. "She was here earlier," Earl said, looking out the window as the storm gathered momentum. "She was just fine. Pedaled off toward the bridge about an hour ago, I'd say. That was the last I saw." Charles nodded and drove on, his headlights cutting through the thickening storm, trying to retrace her path. There was nothing, only snow, trees, and the biting wind. He drove over the bridge, checking the roads along the river, his tires squealing as he turned around and headed back. He pulled into the driveway at 11:30, his face pale with worry. Clara was waiting at the door, her expression as strained as his. "She's not on the road," Charles said quietly, his hands still shaking from the cold. "I'm going to call the police." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as Clara dialed the number. "Yes, my daughter. She's missing," Clara said into the phone, her voice cracking. "She hasn't come home. She's not on the road. She's not anywhere." The words hit her like a punch, and suddenly, everything that had been normal about that evening felt horribly wrong. Clara could hear the officer's voice on the other end, still calm, But something else began to settle inside her. A terrible fear she couldn't shake. Minutes later, Detective John Marshall arrived. His heavy boots echoed on the floor as he walked into the Carter household, the air cold and heavy from the storm. His voice was low, measured. "Tell me everything," he said. The investigation began. The town of Atlanta felt different the morning after Tiffany Carter disappeared. The snow had not let up, and the landscape was eerily still, as though the storm had put the entire city into a state of suspended animation. The only movement was the faint puff of breath from people who dared to venture outside, and the slow grind of snowplows clearing the streets. Inside the Carter home, the quiet was suffocating. Clara stood by the window, her hand trembling against the glass. She hadn't slept. The image of Tiffany's empty chair at the dinner table haunted her. Charles had gone out again at first light, retracing his steps from the night before. His car tracks had been swallowed by new snow, and yet there was still no sign of Tiffany. His frustration and fear were growing, too. The town was small, barely 3 miles across, and when something like this happened, the whole community felt it. In less than 12 hours, the word had spread. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers began to rally, offering to search the surrounding woods, alleyways, and riverside paths. The family was not alone in their fear. The search had begun, and the town had already shifted its focus. It felt like a race against time. Detective John Marshall was out by 8 a.m., still wearing the same coat from the night before. The layers of snow on the ground had made everything look different, unfamiliar, like a world frozen in time. Marshall had been to this part of town 1,000 times. He knew the roads, the houses, the rhythm of the small community. But today, there was no rhythm, only tension. As he drove past the small gas station at the edge of town, his headlights swept over the familiar facade. Earl Dawson was already there, his old plaid shirt tucked into faded jeans. He was shoveling snow in front of the station, his movements mechanical. Earl looked up as Marshall approached. "You see anything strange last night?" Marshall asked, his voice as cold as the wind outside. Earl paused, his shovel hanging midair. "Not much. I told you yesterday." She came in, bought a soda, smiled, said she was heading home. After that, it's all fog. Not even a car went by until I locked up. It was quiet. Did anyone else come through? A car? A truck? Earl thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. There was a brown sedan, maybe a truck, parked just as she left. I saw the headlights flash, but I didn't pay it much mind. Old beat-up wagon. I didn't notice anyone in it. Marshall jotted down a note, his mind racing. The details were starting to form, but they felt incomplete. An old, beat-up wagon. Had it been there just by coincidence? Or had it followed Tiffany out into the storm? It wasn't much to go on, but Marshall had learned over the years that even the smallest details could reveal something crucial. The gas station was just at the corner of Dent Bridge, where Tiffany had last been seen. Marshall had already checked the bridge twice the night before, combing the banks along the river for any sign. But in the morning light, the water below looked different. The current had slowed with the storm, and the river was choked with ice. He knew better than to expect answers here, but there was still something about the place that made him uneasy. Marshall had hoped to find something new. Instead, the search seemed to bring more questions. And as the day passed, the lead he had hoped would break the case open began to feel more like a dead end. He pulled into the parking lot of the old diner near the river, where some of the searchers had gathered. The low hum of voices filled the room, blending with the scent of fresh coffee and toast. At the counter, a few officers were speaking with Clara, trying to comfort her, but there was an air of quiet desperation among them all. "Any new developments?" Marshall asked as he took a seat beside the sheriff. "No sign of her." "Nothing," Sheriff Daniels replied. His voice was heavy with defeat. "We've combed through every inch of the town. The woods are still quiet. No tire tracks by the river, no new witnesses. It's like she disappeared into the snow." Marshall shook his head. "We're missing something. There's a detail we're not seeing." As if on cue, the phone rang, breaking the stillness of the room. Clara's head jerked toward it. The sound of the receiver clicking seemed to stretch into eternity. "Hello." Clara's voice wavered. "Clara, it's Dale Harper from the sheriff's office." "We need to talk," came the voice on the other end. Her face drained of color. "What's happened? What do you know? Please." Marshall watched as Clara's hand tightened around the receiver. She looked pale, her knuckles white as she slowly pulled the phone away from her ear. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Nothing," she whispered. Nothing at all. Marshall knew the moment he heard her voice that they had found something. But it wasn't a breakthrough. It was something far worse. The look in her eyes told him all he needed to know. Marshall stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Sheriff," he said, a hint of urgency creeping into his voice. "We need to go back to the river. We're missing something." By late afternoon, the storm had worsened, blanketing the town with another layer of snow, obscuring any new traces. Marshall drove along Dent Bridge Road once more, the weight of Clara's earlier words hanging over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he arrived at the bridge, a group of volunteer searchers had gathered, their footprints cutting jagged lines in the freshly fallen snow. Marshall climbed out of the car and made his way to the riverbank. And then he saw it. A flash of something metallic glinted from beneath the snow. His heart skipped a beat. He kneeled, brushing aside the layer of snow that had settled on the ground. A few more seconds, and he uncovered what he'd been looking for. A set of tire tracks, faint but visible against the soft, white blanket. They were small, too small for a truck, and they led straight to the water's edge. A feeling of dread washed over him. He followed the tracks with his eyes, his mind already processing the implications. The tire marks stopped abruptly at the water's edge. The wind howled around him, and for a moment, he could almost hear Tiffany's voice in his mind. Her laugh, her voice, the promise of her return. But there was nothing here, just tracks that led nowhere. Marshall cursed under his breath forming thick clouds of vapor in the cold air. That was when it hit him. Tiffany wasn't lost. Someone had taken her, and they had led her here, to the water, to disappear into the storm. The next few hours would be crucial. Marshall could feel the pressure building inside his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he'd uncover. But one thing was clear. Whoever had taken Tiffany, they were watching, waiting for the storm to pass. And Marshall wasn't going to let that happen. The storm had subsided by the time Marshall returned to his office that evening. The streets, still coated in layers of snow, reflected the fading light of the day. It felt like the town had been caught in an endless cycle. Tension built in every corner, but no one knew what to expect when it would finally break. The quiet hum of the heater in his small office was the only sound that kept the silence from swallowing him whole. Sitting at his desk, Marshall laid out the photos of Tiffany Carter on the table in front of him. Pictures of her at school, a family portrait, the one taken at the library just 2 weeks before her disappearance. The face was familiar, yet foreign, like someone he knew but had never truly seen. He could feel the weight of her absence in the room, pressing down on his chest, and he knew he needed more than just the physical clues. He needed to understand who Tiffany really was, what she had been running from, and why. He started with her friends. The first was Rachel Foster, Tiffany's best friend since childhood. Rachel had been the last person to speak to Tiffany in person before she disappeared. Marshall met her at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, a place the two had often visited after school. Rachel was sitting in a booth, her eyes red-rimmed from a long day of worrying. The sleeves of her sweater were rolled up, exposing a tattoo of a butterfly on her wrist, something Tiffany had always joked about wanting. Rachel had been waiting for this moment, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her coffee cup as Marshall sat down across from her. "She's always been the one who kept everything inside," Rachel said, her voice cracking before she could even begin. "I know it sounds crazy, but Tiffany was scared, detective. She didn't tell me everything, but she was hiding something." Marshall nodded, his gaze steady. "What do you mean? Was she having problems at school? With her family?" Rachel shifted in her seat, looking out the window at the falling dusk. The snow outside was relentless, just like the silence between them. She was seeing someone, but she didn't want to talk about it. "Not to me. I tried asking, but she always changed the subject. I think that's why she started pulling away. She was scared of something, but she wouldn't say what." Marshall's pen scratched a note down on his pad. "Did she ever mention his name?" Rachel shook her head. "No, she didn't. But I know it had to be someone who knew her well. She trusted him. I'm sure of it." Marshall felt a sinking sensation. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, no clear shape yet. But if someone Tiffany trusted had been involved, then it only made sense that it was someone from her close circle. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her voice quieter now. "I should have pushed her harder. I should have gotten her to talk." Marshall leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "It's not your fault. We're all trying to understand what happened. That's why I need you to think. Who might have been close to Tiffany and might know something?" Rachel looked away, biting her lip, her mind churning. Finally, she sighed. There was this guy, Doug Wilson. Tiffany talked about him a lot. They had been close friends, you know? But lately, she'd been avoiding him. She'd tell me they'd had a fight. She wouldn't say what it was about, but I could tell something wasn't right. Marshall's pen paused over the notebook. Doug Wilson? Yeah, Rachel said. He's a year older than us. He lives out on Magnolia Street, near the old warehouse. His mom's kind of a mess, and his dad left when he was little. He's a good guy, or at least I thought he was, but something changed. Tiffany and Doug, they had some kind of falling out, but I don't know why. The mention of Doug Wilson sent a cold ripple through Marshall's chest. He knew Doug by reputation, an unassuming, quiet boy with a quick temper, someone who had struggled through the years after his father left. But was it enough to turn him into something darker? Could Tiffany's fight with him have been the breaking point? The next morning, Marshall made his way to Doug Wilson's house, a small, weathered cottage on the outskirts of town. The street was eerily quiet, houses sitting in their old frames like long-forgotten memories. As Marshall approached the front porch, he could see the thin curtains pulled across the window and the faint flicker of a television inside. Doug opened the door when Marshall knocked, his eyes wary but not hostile. He was a tall young man with dark, unkempt hair and a weathered face, the kind that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His hands were jammed deep into the pockets of his jacket, and the smell of cigarette smoke clung to the air around him. Detective Marshall, Doug said, his voice flat. What's this about? I told you guys everything. I need to ask you some more questions, Doug. You were close to Tiffany, right? She confided in you. Doug's eyes shifted, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Yeah, we were friends. What of it? Marshall could sense the unease in Doug's stance, the way his eyes darted away from Marshall's gaze. Something wasn't right here. Doug was hiding something, but Marshall couldn't tell yet whether it was guilt or fear. Rachel told me you and Tiffany had a falling out, Marshall said, watching Doug's face closely. What happened? Doug's gaze hardened. He shifted uncomfortably. It's none of your business, okay? She was a good friend. She was different the last few weeks. I didn't know what was going on with her. Marshall took a slow step forward, trying to read Doug's body language. Doug, we're trying to find out what happened to her. She's missing, and you're the last person who saw her. If you know something, you need to tell me. I didn't do anything, Doug shot back, his voice rising for the first time. I didn't hurt her. She just got weird, all right? I don't know what was going on in her head. She kept pushing me away. Marshall held up a hand, keeping the peace. I'm not accusing you, Doug, but something happened between you and Tiffany, and you need to help me understand what. Doug turned away, pacing back into the house, his shoulders tense. I didn't hurt her, he muttered again, more to himself than to Marshall. She was just upset, okay? She told me she didn't want to be friends anymore. Said she was tired of me following her around. Marshall knew he was close. There was something in Doug's tone that didn't sit right. This wasn't just about a friendship gone sour. There was more beneath the surface, something dark that hadn't been said. Where were you the night Tiffany disappeared, Doug? Marshall pressed, his voice steady, but insistent. Doug's hesitation was enough of an answer. He knew more than he was saying. Marshall's conversation with Doug was fruitless, but something Doug had said stuck with him. The mention of Tiffany, pushing him away. Rachel's words rang in his ears. She was scared of something, detective. She didn't tell me everything, but she was hiding something. That was the key. Marshall needed to know what Tiffany had been hiding. And if Doug had been involved, then he was the one who had to help uncover it. Marshall wasn't sure whether Doug was guilty, but he knew one thing. He wasn't telling the whole truth. Later that night, Marshall reviewed the case files again. Come in, Marshall said, his voice flat, his eyes still on the photos. The door creaked open, and Officer Ryan Davis stepped inside, holding a file in his hands. He looked like he had something to say, something that might just push the case forward. Got something, detective, Ryan said, his voice low. He walked over to the desk, sliding the file toward Marshall. It's about Tiffany. We found something you might want to see. Marshall's fingers gripped the edge of the file. What is it? Ryan hesitated for a moment, glancing at the file in his hands. We found something that belonged to Tiffany. Something that might explain why she was so distant in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Marshall's curiosity piqued, his brow furrowing. What did you find? Ryan opened the file and slid out a small, worn journal. It looked old, the leather cover cracked and faded, as though it had been kept in a drawer for years. A few pages were dog-eared, and the pages themselves were yellowing with age. This was found in a storage unit just outside of town. It was buried under some boxes, hidden away. No one knew about it until now. Marshall's eyes narrowed. He reached for the journal, feeling the cool, worn leather beneath his fingers. As he opened it, the faint scent of dust and old paper filled the air. He began to flip through the pages, each one filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. At first, it was what he expected: notes about school, small personal observations about friends and family. But then, on a page near the back, his eyes stopped. The words jumped out at him like a cold wave. "I don't know who to trust anymore. I've been thinking about running away. I think I'm in danger. I'm scared of what might happen if I stay here. Doug says I'm paranoid. He says I'm imagining things, but I know something is wrong. I know he's hiding something from me. I don't know how long I can keep pretending everything's normal. I'm terrified." Marshall's heart skipped a beat. The words were raw, desperate, and above all, they were Tiffany's. She had been afraid of someone close to her. Doug. Marshall's mind raced. I don't know who to trust anymore. Had Tiffany suspected Doug from the beginning? Had she realized, before anyone else, that something darker was at play? And why hadn't she told anyone? The weight of her fear, locked away in those pages, felt suffocating, as if Tiffany had been carrying a burden too heavy for someone her age to bear. Ryan watched Marshall's reaction, his face tense. We think this might be why she distanced herself from Doug. It wasn't just a teenage spat like he said. There was something more. Marshall closed the journal slowly, his fingers lingering on the cover for a moment longer. This changes everything, he muttered, more to himself than to Ryan. Doug was more than just a friend. He was a part of whatever she was afraid of. But what the hell happened to her? Ryan stood quietly beside him. The question is, what now? Marshall set the journal aside, running a hand through his hair. His mind was working faster now, piecing things together in a way they hadn't before. We need to go back to Doug. This journal is proof that something went wrong, something Tiffany was trying to escape. If Doug's involved, we need to know how. We need to bring him in again. Later that afternoon, Marshall arrived at Doug Wilson's house, his mind reeling. He could feel the tension building again, the same weight he'd felt the day he first met Doug. There was something in the way Doug had acted, his defensiveness, his reluctance to talk. Marshall wasn't sure whether Doug knew what had happened to Tiffany or whether he was caught up in something much bigger than himself. But one thing was certain: Doug's involvement was no longer just a possibility. It was a necessity to the case. Doug answered the door with the same distant expression he had the first time Marshall had approached him. This time, however, there was no warmth, no indifference. Doug's eyes darted nervously, betraying something deeper, a hidden fear. Marshall didn't waste any time. Doug, we need to talk. Doug stepped back, eyes widening. What's this about now? I already told you everything. Marshall's eyes narrowed. No, Doug, you didn't. I just read something that changes everything. Tiffany wrote about being scared. She wrote about you. And I need to know what you did to her. Doug's face flushed with color. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his mouth stayed shut. I didn't hurt her, Doug stammered, his voice low. I didn't mean to. I don't know what happened, okay? Marshall's patience was wearing thin. You need to tell me everything, Doug. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. It's something else. And if you're hiding something, I'll find out. Doug's eyes flickered, his breath quickening. He stepped back, retreating into the shadows of his house, as if the walls themselves were swallowing him up. You're not going to believe me, Doug said quietly, his voice shaking. Try me, Marshall replied, his tone hard. Doug took a deep breath, then let out a shaky exhale. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. I didn't want it to go that far. I don't know what happened. We were supposed to go to the movie, but she started arguing with me. She didn't want to go with me. She didn't want to be around me anymore. I snapped. Marshall felt his pulse quicken as Doug continued, the words spilling out in a flood. I followed her after she left the library. I told her I was just going to drive her home. I just wanted to talk. But she wouldn't listen. She got out of the car and tried to run. I grabbed her arm, but she fell. She hit her head on the door frame. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear, detective. But when I looked at her, she was unconscious. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Marshall's stomach churned as Doug's confession unfolded in front of him. It was a confession, but it wasn't enough to explain what happened next. What did you do after that? Doug's voice dropped to a whisper. I drove her to the bridge. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want anyone to find out. I pushed the car into the river. I thought she was dead. I swear. I thought she was dead. Marshall's mind swirled with the gravity of Doug's words. It was no longer just an accident. It was murder. The fear, the panic, it had all led to this moment. Doug collapsed onto the couch, his face pale and filled with regret. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just didn't know what else to do. Marshall stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of Doug's confession. But there was something else, something that still didn't add up. You didn't call for help, Marshall said, his voice steady, his eyes hard. Why? Doug's voice cracked as he finally answered. I was scared. I thought no one would believe me. I thought they would think I killed her. Marshall stood motionless, his breath steady. He had his answer. But the case wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The following day, the storm had passed, but the cold, silent weight of Tiffany Carter's disappearance still hung over the town like an oppressive fog. Atlanta, normally bustling with life, now felt eerily still, as if every street, every corner was waiting for something to break the tension. The quiet had settled in like a wound that hadn't quite healed. Detective Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, even after Doug Wilson's confession. There were too many pieces left unaccounted for, too many unanswered questions that still gnawed at him. Doug had confessed, but there was still no body, no tangible evidence linking him directly to the scene. The case, as Marshall knew all too well, wasn't as simple as it seemed. He sat in his car outside the Wilson house that morning, the low hum of the engine keeping him grounded as he tried to process everything he had learned. Doug had admitted to pushing Tiffany's car into the river, but Marshall wasn't convinced. He needed something more, something concrete to bring this case to its conclusion. As Marshall sat there, staring at the house, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ryan Davis, his officer on the case. We found something, Ryan said, his voice clipped and urgent. You need to get down to the old dock by River Street. Now. Marshall's heart skipped. A lead this late in the investigation could mean only one thing. The case was about to take a turn. He started the engine and sped off toward the docks, his mind racing. The river. He hadn't been back there since the first night of the search, but it was the only place where he hadn't looked closely enough. He couldn't shake the feeling that the water was hiding something, that it had swallowed Tiffany's secret and would only reveal it when it was good and ready. The docks were deserted when Marshall arrived, the heavy fog clinging to the water like a veil, shrouding everything in an eerie, suffocating silence. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the snow-covered ground. Ryan Davis stood near the edge of the dock, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on the water. Marshall walked toward him, not saying a word. He didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. Ryan motioned toward the water, his breath visible in the frigid air. We found it, detective. Found her bike. Down by the old warehouse dock. Looks like it's been there since the night she disappeared. Marshall's stomach tightened. He looked down at the bike, its faded blue paint barely visible under the water's surface. It was tilted sideways, half submerged in the murky depths. It was a haunting sight. Tiffany's bike, the one she'd been riding the night she vanished. But what was it doing here? And why hadn't they found it before? The tire tracks, Marshall said, his voice low. We never searched this area thoroughly. We were focused on the bridge. Ryan nodded, his face grim. We missed it. Didn't even think to check down here. But we had a witness who remembered seeing her bike parked by the old dock last night. She said she saw a guy. Couldn't make out his face, but he was standing near the bike, looking like he was waiting for someone. Marshall stared at the bike, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. If the bike had been here, why hadn't they found it during their initial search? And who had been waiting for Tiffany by the dock? The pieces were starting to align, but Marshall knew they needed more. They needed Doug's confession to match the evidence they had found, and they needed to prove that Doug hadn't acted alone. Get the team down here, Marshall said, his voice hard. I want the area swept. And someone needs to get a dive team to pull that bike out of the water. We need everything we can find. By late afternoon, Marshall had enough. The dive team had pulled Tiffany's bike from the water, confirming that it had been submerged for days. It wasn't just any bike, it was hers. The exact make and model, down to the faded blue color. And, like everything else, it now told a story that was impossible to ignore. Marshall stood in front of the Wilson house once again, his jaw set. Doug's confession had been one thing, but this, the discovery of the bike, was the evidence they had been waiting for. It was time to make the arrest. Inside, Doug was sitting on the couch, his posture stiff, his eyes haunted. His mother sat across from him, her face pale and tear-streaked, clearly unaware of what was about to unfold. Marshall walked in without knocking, his boots heavy against the hardwood floor. Doug looked up, his face paler than usual, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. "Doug Wilson," Marshall said, his voice calm but firm. "You're under arrest for the abduction and murder of Tiffany Carter." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. Doug's mother gasped, her hands shaking as she looked back and forth between Marshall and her son. Doug stood up slowly, his face going white. "What? No, you've got it all wrong. I didn't do it. I didn't." Marshall took a step forward, cutting Doug off. "We found your bike. By the docks. It's Tiffany's. And we know you were there the night she disappeared. You can stop pretending like you don't know what happened." Doug's mouth went dry. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted around the room, as if looking for a way out. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Doug whispered, his voice breaking. "She was supposed to be fine. I didn't kill her, I swear. It was an accident. I panicked." Marshall stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You pushed her car into the river, Doug. You didn't call for help. You didn't try to save her. And you've been hiding from the truth ever since." Doug's mother let out a sharp sob, stepping back, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. "I didn't mean to," Doug repeated, his voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. "I was scared. She wasn't supposed to die. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Marshall shook his head, his gaze hardening. "It doesn't matter what you meant, Doug. What matters is what you did. And now you have to answer for it." By the time Doug was placed in the back of the squad car, the sun was setting. The air had grown colder, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Marshall stood for a long moment, staring at the street, his mind processing everything that had happened. Doug Wilson wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but he was guilty. And the community that had once trusted him would have to live with the consequences of his actions. Marshall didn't know what Doug was feeling in that moment, whether it was regret or fear. Maybe it was both. But the one thing that was clear was that Tiffany Carter's case, the case that had haunted Atlanta for nearly a week, was finally moving toward its end. Marshall took a deep breath, his hands tightening around his coat as the chills settled into his bones. It was over. The arrest had been made. But the pain, the loss that had come with Tiffany's death, would never fully be erased. He glanced at the squad car one last time as it disappeared down the road, then turned back to the house. The next step would be the trial. And as hard as it would be, Marshall knew one thing for sure. Justice, no matter how long it took, had finally arrived for Tiffany Carter. The air in the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The small crowd gathered outside was murmuring in hushed tones, some speaking in disbelief, others with a quiet sense of vindication. Doug Wilson, the quiet boy who had once been a familiar face in Atlanta, was now the center of it all. His arrest had shocked the community, but nothing compared to the trial that was about to unfold. Detective Marshall stood in the shadows outside the courthouse, his hands buried in his coat pockets. The cold wind cut through him, but it wasn't the chill of winter that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the weight of everything that had led to this moment. He had been part of this investigation from the very beginning, piecing together the fragments of Tiffany Carter's life, the threads of fear and confusion that had bound her fate to Doug Wilson's in ways no one could have anticipated. Now, everything they had worked for, every sleepless night, every late phone call, was about to culminate in a courtroom. Doug had confessed, but Marshall knew better than to think it would be simple. The truth had a way of hiding in places people didn't want to look. Inside the courtroom, the jury had taken their seats, the tension in the air almost tangible. Clara Carter, Tiffany's mother, sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes red from days of sleeplessness. Marshall could see the strain in her posture. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but it wasn't the kind of moment anyone could truly prepare for. Justice wouldn't bring Tiffany back. It wouldn't fill the empty space in her heart, but it was the only thing that could give her closure. Doug sat on the other side, his shoulders slumped, his face a mixture of fear and resignation. His mother, who had once stood beside him in the small town of Atlanta, was now a stranger in the same room. She couldn't look at him. No one could. The quiet boy from a broken home was no longer the person they once thought they knew. The trial had already proven that. The courtroom doors swung open, and Marshall stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto the defendant's table. Doug was already seated, his head low, avoiding everyone's gaze. It wasn't hard to see the changes in him. He was no longer just a troubled teenager. He was a man on the brink of something far more ominous. Marshall knew what Doug had done, but that wasn't what the jury was there to decide. They needed to know why. The prosecution's case was solid, the evidence damning. Doug's confession, the bike by the river, the tire tracks that led them to the old dock, everything fit. But Marshall had always known the question wasn't just about the what. It was about the why. And that, he hoped, was what would be uncovered today. Tiffany's journal had been read aloud in the opening statements. The words were sharp, cutting through the quiet of the courtroom like a blade. "I'm scared of what might happen if I stay here. Doug says I'm imagining things, but I know something is wrong. I think he's hiding something from me." Those words hung in the air as the prosecution called their first witness, Rachel Foster, Tiffany's best friend. She stood on the stand, her hands shaking, her eyes avoiding Doug's. Rachel recounted the last few days she had spent with Tiffany, how her friend had seemed distant and afraid, how she'd mentioned Doug more than once in passing, but had refused to talk about him directly. She was scared, Rachel said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't know what to do. She kept saying she didn't trust him anymore, but she wouldn't tell me why." The words seemed to echo in the room, reverberating off the walls. Marshall could see the tension building, the way Doug's body seemed to shrink with each passing moment. The jury was listening, absorbing the details that seemed so trivial at first, but it all pointed in one direction, and that direction led right back to Doug. The defense was expected, but no one could have predicted how it would unfold. Doug's attorney, a seasoned lawyer with a slick suit and a confident smile, called Doug to the stand. Marshall's stomach tightened. This was the moment. Doug's defense would likely hinge on one thing: the idea that Tiffany's death was an accident, that the fear he'd confessed to, the panic that had caused him to drive Tiffany to the bridge, was enough to explain his actions. But Marshall knew the truth. He knew it was far worse than that. Doug sat in the witness chair, his eyes trained on the floor. He barely looked up as he spoke, his voice quiet and broken. "I never meant for her to get hurt," Doug said, his voice catching on the words. "I swear to you, I never meant it." The defense attorney leaned in, asking the questions with the precision of a surgeon. "Doug, tell the court again what happened that night. What led to this tragic event?" Doug swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he spoke. "She was upset. I tried to talk to her. I didn't mean to hurt her. I panicked. She wouldn't listen to me, and when she got out of the car, she slipped. I grabbed her arm to pull her back in, but she hit her head on the door frame. I didn't know what to do. She was unconscious, and I thought she was dead. I pushed the car into the water. I thought it was the only way." The defense attorney nodded, as if this was the testimony that would prove their case. "You were scared, Doug, but it was an accident, wasn't it?" Doug nodded vigorously. "Yes, I never meant to hurt her. I swear. I was just scared." Marshall sat in his seat, his jaw clenched. He had heard Doug's confession before, but hearing him say those words again, "I thought she was dead," it still sent a shiver down his spine. The confusion, the fear, it all felt so real, but Marshall knew better. The truth was different. As the defense continued, something unexpected happened. The prosecutor, Daniel Leard, stood up and asked for a recess. The courtroom fell into a low hum of whispers. No one knew what was happening, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marshall's gut twisted as he watched Leard approach the judge with a quiet urgency. The judge's gavel struck, signaling the start of the recess. The room buzzed with questions. What was going on? Marshall turned to the bench, his eyes narrowing. Something had changed. Leard knew something they hadn't expected. 5 minutes later, Leard stood before the judge again. He motioned to the prosecution team, and the room fell silent. "Your Honor, we have new evidence," Leard said, his voice clear and steady. "Evidence that suggests Doug Wilson's involvement in Tiffany Carter's death was not an accident. We have proof that Doug was not alone that night." The courtroom gasped in unison. Marshall's heart raced. "Not alone," he whispered under his breath. Leard continued, his voice cold and unwavering. "The tire tracks at the river were not Doug's. They belonged to another vehicle. And through new forensic analysis, we discovered traces of blood, Tiffany's blood, on the rear bumper of Doug Wilson's car. But there's more." The room was still. "We have a witness. Someone who saw Doug with another man on the night of Tiffany's disappearance. Someone who was there. Doug's face drained of color. His hands began to shake. The truth, the one he had been hiding all along, was finally surfacing. Marshall could feel it. The twist, the moment everything would change. The courtroom was still, the weight of Leard's revelation hanging in the air like a cloud that refused to break. Doug Wilson's face had drained of color, his shoulders hunched as though trying to make himself smaller, to disappear. His eyes flicked around the room, not meeting anyone's gaze. Marshall watched him closely. He had seen many guilty men under stress, but Doug's reaction was different. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated. Marshall could feel the shift in the room. The audience, once unsure of the case, now had something to hold on to. Leard's words had opened a new door, one that promised answers, but also raised new questions. Who was the other man? And why hadn't Doug mentioned him before? The judge called for another recess, and the murmur of the courtroom swelled into a sea of whispers. Marshall turned and walked toward the back, his mind already racing. A witness? Blood on the rear bumper? He needed to know more. This wasn't just an accident anymore. Doug Wilson wasn't the only one involved in Tiffany Carter's death, and the mystery was only deepening. The break in the trial was brief, but Marshall had enough time to make some calls. He had to know who this witness was, and more importantly, who the man in Doug's car had been. His phone buzzed with the incoming number he'd been hoping for. It was Officer Ryan Davis. "You're not going to believe this," Ryan said on the other end, his voice low, tense. The witness came forward. "They saw Doug with another guy that night, but there's more. They say the guy's name is Frank Daniels." Marshall froze. The name hit him like a punch in the gut. Frank Daniels wasn't just a name from the past, it was a ghost from it. Marshall had worked with Frank Daniels years ago, back when he was still a beat cop in the same precinct. Daniels had been a hothead, a man who couldn't stay out of trouble. But he had disappeared a long time ago, after an incident that had cost him his badge. Marshall hadn't heard from him since, and now this. Daniels was back, tied to the one case that had haunted him most. "You're sure it's Frank Daniels?" Marshall asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Positive," Ryan replied. "I ran a check. Frank Daniels' last known address was just a few miles out of town, but he hasn't been seen in years. I'm digging into his records now. I'll send you everything we have." Marshall hung up, his mind working furiously. Frank Daniels had been a part of a small group of officers who'd gotten caught up in a string of corruption cases, all swept under the rug. Daniels had disappeared shortly after, rumored to have taken some money and left town. The fact that he was involved in this case, the disappearance of Tiffany Carter, was no coincidence. Marshall knew that Daniels had a lot of skeletons in his closet, and now, it seemed, one of them had walked right back into his life. Marshall felt his pulse quicken. How did Daniels fit into this? Later that evening, Marshall made his way to the old, rundown house on the outskirts of town where Frank Daniels had once lived. It was quiet now, with only the faint hum of the streetlights cutting through the shadows. The house was abandoned, the paint peeling off the wooden siding, windows boarded up. Marshall stepped up to the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The air felt wrong, thick with the weight of memories he had long tried to forget. He knocked once, then again, louder this time. There was no answer. Marshall stepped back, eyes scanning the darkened yard. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the house stood silent, like a tomb. He turned to leave when he heard a faint noise from inside, a shuffle, a rustle of movement. His hand went instinctively to the gun at his side as he took a cautious step toward the door. "Frank Daniels," Marshall called out, his voice low, firm. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." For a moment, there was nothing. Then the door creaked open, just enough to reveal a pair of tired, bloodshot eyes peering through the crack. "You need to leave, Marshall," the voice rasped from inside. "There's nothing for you here." Marshall's hand clenched around the doorknob. "Open the door, Daniels. I'm not here to argue. I'm here for the truth." The door creaked open further, revealing a man who looked nothing like the sharp officer Marshall had known years ago. Frank Daniels had aged poorly, his once powerful frame now gaunt and hollow. His face was lined with years of regret, or perhaps fear. His eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. "What do you want?" Daniels asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marshall stepped into the dimly lit house without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the empty rooms. "I'm here because of Tiffany Carter. We know you were involved in her death, and we know you were with Doug Wilson the night she disappeared." "What happened, Frank?" Daniels stepped back, his face contorting with a mix of shame and guilt. "You don't understand," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "It wasn't supposed to go like this. I wasn't supposed to be here." Marshall's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment everything would fall into place. "Start talking. I'm done waiting." Daniels hesitated, his breath shallow. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of years of secrets. "I wasn't supposed to be in town that night," Daniels said, his voice trembling. "But Doug came to me. He said he needed help, that he was in trouble. I didn't want to get involved, but he said Tiffany was going to ruin him, that she was going to tell everyone about what they'd been doing. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know about the blackmail." "Blackmail?" Marshall asked, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" Daniels shook his head, his eyes wild. "It was never supposed to happen. Tiffany found out things about Doug, things he didn't want anyone to know. Things about money, about people he owed favors to. She was going to ruin him. He said she was threatening him. I was just supposed to get him out of it, make it all go away." Marshall's stomach churned as he pieced together the narrative. Doug Wilson, desperate, afraid that Tiffany would expose the web of lies and debts he had gotten tangled in, had called in Frank Daniels for help. And now, Daniels was here, trying to cover his tracks, but the truth was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You didn't help him, Frank," Marshall said, his voice cold. "You did more than that. You let her die." Daniels' face twisted with shame. "I never meant for her to die. I just couldn't let her go. She had to be stopped. Doug didn't know what to do. But I pushed the car into the water. I didn't think she'd die. I thought I was just making it go away." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank Daniels had just confessed to everything. His role in the crime, the lies, the murder, all of it. Marshall's eyes narrowed. "You made sure she stayed down, didn't you, Frank?" Daniels didn't answer. He didn't have to. His eyes, filled with regret, said it all. Marshall didn't waste another second. He pulled out his handcuffs and clicked them onto Daniels' wrists with a sense of finality. "You're under arrest for the murder of Tiffany Carter," he said, his voice calm but filled with anger. "You're not getting away this time." Daniels barely flinched, his face hollow, as if he had resigned himself to the consequences. As Marshall led him outside, the fog had thickened once again, swallowing up the world around them. The headlights of Marshall's car flickered against the mist, casting eerie shadows across the yard. Doug Wilson had thought he was the only one involved, but now it was clear. Doug was just a small part of the larger picture, a picture that had finally started to make sense. The case wasn't over yet, but with Frank Daniels' confession, the final pieces were falling into place. The truth had been buried beneath layers of lies, blackmail, and fear. But now, it was being uncovered, piece by piece. And as Marshall drove Daniels to the station, he could feel something shifting in the air. Tiffany Carter's story was no longer a mystery. It was a truth, finally uncovered after too many years of silence. The small, dimly lit courtroom felt suffocating as Marshall stood at the back, his eyes trained on the defendant's table. The trial had reached its final day, the room thick with the tension of a community that had been waiting for answers. Doug Wilson, now facing charges of manslaughter and evidence tampering, sat stoically with his attorney beside him. His once familiar, confident demeanor had been replaced by a quiet, defeated posture. Beside him, Frank Daniels, shackled and with a solemn expression, awaited the final part of his own fate. His confession had shaken the courtroom in a way no one had expected, revealing just how deep the lies had gone. Tiffany Carter's death, once shrouded in mystery, had finally been pulled into the light. But this chapter wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the reckoning that was coming, about justice that was long overdue. Marshall could feel the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Every sleepless night, every broken lead, had all been worth it. Today, the truth would be fully exposed, and there would be no more shadows left in the case. The closing arguments had begun. The prosecutor, Daniel Leard, stood before the jury with a calm but authoritative presence. His words cut through the stillness of the room, each syllable measured and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Leard began, his voice strong. "For too long, this town has been haunted by the disappearance of Tiffany Carter. The days have turned into months, and the months have turned into years. But today, we stand on the edge of justice. We've heard the evidence, Doug Wilson's confession, the blood on his car, the tire tracks leading to the river. But most of all, We've heard the words of Frank Daniels, a man who has been hiding in plain sight for too long. He's admitted his role in this crime. He pushed Tiffany's car into the river, thinking he could bury her secret forever. Marshall stood in the back, watching the prosecutor, and for a fleeting moment, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before, a sense of closure. The case wasn't just about putting away the guilty party. It was about giving Tiffany Carter her justice. The justice that had eluded her for far too long. Laird's voice rang out again, strong and unwavering. Doug Wilson was not alone. His actions, while terrible, were part of a larger web of lies and fear. He was manipulated by Frank Daniels, a man who used his position and influence to cover up a crime that should have been brought to light years ago. Today, we seek not only justice for Tiffany, but for every family who has ever had to live with a secret they couldn't escape. Doug's attorney stood next, his voice shaky, but still trying to maintain some semblance of confidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, yes, Doug Wilson made a terrible mistake. But it was not murder. It was a tragic accident, one that he never intended. Doug never meant for Tiffany to die. Yes, he panicked, and in that moment of fear, he made an irreversible decision. But he is not a killer. He's a young man who made a mistake he will live with for the rest of his life. Marshall couldn't help but shake his head. Doug's defense was weak. The evidence was irrefutable. This wasn't an accident. This was a series of choices, decisions driven by fear, guilt, and a desire to cover up the truth. There was no escaping it now. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but in the end, the silence was broken by the sharp sound of the door opening. The judge called the courtroom to attention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of the decision. We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Doug Wilson, guilty of manslaughter in the second degree. And we find Frank Daniels guilty of evidence tampering and conspiracy to commit manslaughter. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Tiffany's mother, Clara Carter, sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, the weight of the truth settling in her chest. Marshall felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and sorrow. It was over. Justice had been served, but it had come at a price. In the days following the trial, the town of Atlanta slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The whispers had faded, the questions silenced, but Marshall knew that the case wouldn't leave him so easily. He had also come to terms with the fact that sometimes justice doesn't come with peace, it comes with truth. And the truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds its way back to the surface. Tiffany Carter's story reminds us that even in silence, the truth waits. That courage is found not only in those who seek answers, but in those who refuse to stop asking the hard questions. If this story moved you, take a moment. Subscribe to Crime Cases Unwrapped, because every story deserves to be told, and every voice deserves to be heard. Subscribe now, and never miss the stories that demand justice.